All right. It looks like we are live.
All right.
All right. Fantastic. Well, joining to me today for this very interesting episode, a very special guest. Felipe, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do to get us started?
Yes, absolutely. So thanks very much, first of all, for this invitation. I am a professor at Duke in the Department of Philosophy primarily, but secondarily in the Psychology and Neuroscience department. And I am also the principal investigator of the Imagination and Modal Cognition Lab at the Center for Cognitive Neuroscience here at Duke University.
Okay, cool. So you have joint appointments in the psychology and the philosophy program.
That is correct. I am duly appointed.
You're totally right. And you actually run your own psychology lab as well as your regular professor duties in philosophy as well, correct?
That is correct. I have a background in both in philosophy and in psychology and in cognitive neuroscience. And I have straddled the two disciplines all my life. I did my undergrad at the Universidad Nacional in Colombia, in Bogota, where I studied philosophy and neuropsychology. There was no such a thing as cognitive neuroscience back then, or at least not back in Colombia. And the only way of really sort of seeing the relationship between the mind and the brain was through neuropsychology. So I studied a lot of neuropsychology. And then I did a master's at Tufts University, where I studied philosophy and I was affiliated in the Center for Cognitive Studies. And then I did sort of a parallel PhD in philosophy and in psychology and neuroscience at UNC. Uh, After that, I did a postdoc that was only in psychology and cogneuro at Harvard in Dan Schachter's lab. And then I came here as one of those joint appointees in philosophy and in psychology and neuroscience. So
Wow,
I have
that's a
been, yeah, in both places.
yeah, that's amazing. I mean, this is exactly you're exactly the type of person I like to speak to because I'm really interested in the intersection of philosophy, psychology, and neuroscience. That's a lot where my own work and interests are focused, and so I really try to find other people that have this interest. But you have more than the interest; you really have the bona fides in both fields. So that's rare, but also I hope increasingly less rare. You know, it'd be cool if
I,
more there were more people like you.
that is the hope. We're working on that. A lot of the work that I do here at Duke, not only in the lab, but also, for instance, I co-direct the summer seminars in neuroscience and philosophy, which have precisely that goal to try
Right.
to cross-train people. You're starting to see more and more people that really have the cross-training now.
Oh, that's cool. You know what? I know about those Snap things, but I didn't know you co-directed it. That's cool.
Yeah, this we're in our seventh year, and going strong. Still having to apply for grants. So if any of the listeners here wants
Yeah.
to donate, but we're still applying for grants, but it's still going strong, and I love that program.
So you basically you have your typical kind of conference thing, but also in what's really innovative about it is you try to pair like philosophers and neuroscience together to propose an experiment,
Correct.
which they can run or work together on at the end of it or something like that, right?
Right. It need not be an experiment. It could be a theoretical project as well.
Hmm.
But the point is that it's a 2 week thing in which in the first week, 10 philosophers and 10 neuroscientists slash psychologists that are in their early careers, or typically advanced graduate students, postdocs, or early faculty, they come together and they take classes. It's very intense during the first week. They take classes in each other's disciplines, uh, and then they start working toward the project. And then the second week, what happens is that there are debates or like specific topics that are discussed by one philosopher and one scientist. Say like one day is emotion, one day is consciousness, one day is metacognition, or what have you. And in the afternoons they work, and then there is a final conference, and then there's time to get feedback from all the speakers and all the teachers and so forth. And then basically, after all that feedback, the teams have about a month to put together a grant that has the shape of an R03 or an R21. Then they can submit to us, and then the idea is that we can, if they earn it, they get the grant. But in addition to that, they get the feedback to actually put a grant to NIH. So
Wow.
so so it's a very very strong training program, and I love it. It's really one of my highlights of the year.
That's amazing. So I'll make sure there's a link to that because I
That is
hadn't even
correct.
thought of that.
Yeah.
That's very cool. So you do a lot of very cool stuff, and hopefully there'll be more cool people doing cool stuff. But it's interesting. I'm glad you mentioned consciousness is still in the list there. I know something about your background that you mentioned that you were at Tufts and you had an interest in consciousness. And so now you're primarily working on memory, as I understand your
Yes.
research.
Yes.
So, and not consciousness, although there's some overlap perhaps. Uh, but so I am a bit curious about how you gravitated out. I guess part of it is because you're more interested in like experimental designs, and it's hard to think of the how to really operationalize maybe the variables when it comes to consciousness. But is that part of it, or was there more to it?
But that was a little bit of it. Um, so I had, when I was an undergrad, I had a very, very strong interest in memory, because as I mentioned, in addition to doing my philosophy undergrad, I was also a student in neuropsychology, and my
Mhm.
advisor back then, who's now an emeritus professor, Dr. Patricia Montañez, she was the head of what it was called the Clinic of Memory,
Mhm.
in a military hospital in Bogota. And basically, she was an expert on memory, uh, and she was seeing patients with normal and pathological aging. But in addition to that, because I'm from Colombia and I was rotating in the military hospital, many of our patients had wounds that were like war wounds, bullets or mines or what have you. And she was the specialist in memory complaints. So I was exposed to memory issues since I was, I don't know, 18 or 19 years of age. Um,
Wow.
and uh, and I loved it. I thought it was very, very interesting. But at the same time, I was very interested in philosophy, and I was studying philosophy, like really hardcore philosophy, especially kind of like continental for the most part. So I read a lot of Husserl. I read, I was reading classics and so forth. And I took a couple of classes in analytic philosophy, and uh, and then it's interesting because I was very interested in Fodor. I was really interested in the language of thought, and I was really interested in functionalism. And
Hmm.
only toward the end of my undergraduate career, I came to read Pat Churchland and Dan Dennett. They were kind of like, right now the Department of Philosophy looks very different, but the philosophy department that I went to as an undergrad was very continental and very anti-sciencey. So Churchland and Dennett, and they were seeing us like maybe no-nos, except for this one professor that sort of handed it to me under the table, and I read them and I sort of fell in love with them. But there was a lot of consciousness going on in those books, and so my feeling was that if I wanted to do philosophy of mind that was empirically oriented, I needed to study or consciousness or perception, and that was where the action was for this intersection. And if I wanted to be a scientist, then I kept studying memory, but there wasn't a philosophy of memory, as it were,
Right.
right?
Hmm.
And that was my feeling too. And at Tufts, I couldn't get into a PhD program coming directly from my undergrad in Colombia. So I did my master's at Tufts, and at Tufts I worked under Dennett. So I did study a lot of consciousness, and we talked quite a bit about it. In fact, my writing sample was for my PhD program was on Searle's account of consciousness and his biological dualism, or whatever is the name of that crazy
He calls
book.
it biological naturalism, but other people
Oh,
accuse
yeah,
him of dualism.
yeah, and
Poor Searle. Yeah, not poor Searle. No, never mind. But still, poor the view of Searle.
yeah, exactly. So I was very interested, and I thought that I wanted to do that. But then in grad school, I was doing the philosophy stuff, but I was also rotating in labs in the psychology department, and I started taking classes and rotating in the class of Joe Hopfinger, who's an
Mm.
attention researcher. And back then, as you might remember, we're talking 2005, 2006. There was this big discussion about the relationship between attention and consciousness. And people would say like, oh, attention is necessary for
Right.
consciousness. And people were like, no, 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 you can have consciousness in the near absence of attention, I think is. And
That's
Jesse
right when I
Greenspan,
got to New York, so I remember
that's
that.
right.
very
And
much
Jesse
going
Priest was
on.
my advisor in philosophy, and
Oh,
he
I
was
didn't. Oh,
working
right. Okay.
on attention and conscious. So I thought this is just natural for me to work. But at the same time, I was taking classes on memory
Wait,
and
so you went from Tufts to
to
North
UNC.
Carolina?
Yes, that's right. That's where I did my PhD at UNC.
Okay, cool.
Uh, and then to make what could be an even longer story much shorter, um, part of my dissatisfaction started with the fact that operationalization is a very tricky thing in psychology. Defining something is not the same as operationalizing it. And
Right,
oftentimes, because the operationalization, it has to be, linked to a particular measure. And oftentimes, what I sense is that a bunch of people were sort of talking past one another. Their definitions of attentions were really operationalized, and they became almost incommensurable with one another because often they were very specific to a particular technique, and
right,
that made it pretty annoying to read. And at the same time, I was becoming more and more critical of the cognitive science methods per se. And I just wanted better, better measures and measures
mm,
that I could sense that were more directly linked to something. So recognition was a measure that I felt more comfortable with, hit rates and false alarms and stuff like that.
right.
I slowly switched to working more and more on memory. And then it was a big gambit though, because there was no philosophy of memory back then.
Right.
Uh, so it was like, so do I have to write like two different dissertations, one on some, metaphysics of propositional attitudes, which is what I thought that I was going to be working on, uh,
Okay.
and
Oh, because you
do
like Fodor, right? Language of thought.
yeah,
Okay.
and or do and then I do some scientific work on memory, or should I try to do something with both of them?
Hmm.
And that's how I ended up working on philosophy of memory
You did that after your dissertation? After
during
you defended?
no. During my dissertation was on philosophy of memory. I wrote at UNC, we have to write a
Uh,
master's thesis. I actually published that master's thesis in a book on that I edited too, or helped to edit actually, on content and consciousness.
hmm.
I wrote a long thesis, master's thesis on the semantics of propositional attitude reports, basically.
You know, I think I reviewed that book.
You reviewed that book,
Yeah, I did
exactly.
review
So
that book. Oh, yeah, I should have reread my
yeah,
review, dang it, before
so
the
that
discussion
article
today.
that I wrote for that book was my master's thesis, and I thought that I was going to, I had at that point a committee that had metaphysicians and so forth, and I thought at that point, well, this is philosophical enough. It looks like a space in a
Yeah.
place, logical space. I'm going to develop that into my dissertation. But the truth is that I was working so hard on memory and I was so interested, and I thought there are so many interesting philosophical issues having to do with memory that are not explored in the philosophy of mind. They're
Mm,
perhaps explored in epistemology, but they were also explored with very little regard for what we know of human memory.
right.
So it was kind of disheartening to see many of the discussions in epistemology of memory. So I thought, I'm going to take a gambit and I'm going to start writing stuff on memory from the point of view of philosopher of mind.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting because you're right. It's like the previous, I'm thinking of like Shoemaker's paper, for instance, on what's quasi-memory and memory. A lot of
Yeah,
it's like philosophical debate. What's a real memory and what about duplicates of you that have like same information? Is it memory or not? What about Swamp Man? But so it's interesting that you're saying what I'm hearing you say sort of is that as someone interested in empirical work, you felt like your only option was to go and look at consciousness and attention because that's like when you look at the books, that's what you see. It's like that's in the
yeah,
philosophy of mind. That's we're talking about attention and consciousness, nothing about memory. So you
uh-huh.
really felt torn as between like empirical work and the philosophical work, and so you forged your own way,
Yeah,
making this area that should have been really known. I guess it's now a thriving area. I mean, I've spoken to some people like Carlos Montemayor, for instance, who does who talks about memory and has a whole theory of it and so on. I think it's safe to say that at this point, philosophy of memory is a subfield, or do you think it's
I
still
think
struggling
so.
to? Yeah, okay.
I think so, for
Yeah.
sure. Back then, what was interesting is that you would see certain nuggets of things that other people have written, that were really wonderful to read. So two examples come to mind. One was John Sutton's book on connectionism and memory traces, which was on Descartes and uh, and just a very beautiful philosophical treatment of memory traces and how it relates to Descartes and so forth. And then there was another book, another paper that was very influential. Maria Scheckman wrote a paper criticizing precisely Q memories, quasi memories, as being psychologically improbable. That's exactly the sort of thing that I was looking into,
Uh,
is the view that people, particularly epistemologists, uh, in the 1980s, well, all throughout the 20th century, to be honest, but even as late as the 1980s, 1990s in philosophy, was a very outdated view of memory. It's just like, this is not human memory. It's not
right.
even computer memory. It's like an idealized version of memory.
Yeah.
And one can dismiss it as this is a normative claim of how memory should be. But even if it is normative, it looks as though this is wrong. Memory is not a copy of what happened in the past. It cannot be so faithful. And even if it was that faithful, the rest of the mind goes wrong. As I wrote something like that in my dissertation, that there's a story by Jorge Luis Borges that everyone quotes, which is Funes de Memorias, in which there is this guy, Funes, which is a campesino in the Argentinian Pampa, that falls off a horse and loses his capacity to forget. So he has this perfect, ideal philosophical memory. And what is amazing about that story is that the rest of his mind breaks down
Mm.
when he has this idealized memory, which is, the kind of memory that one would expect a philosopher like Shoemaker or something like that will be congenial to, is
Yeah.
like it
They
messes up the
go.
rest of the mind. And I thought, for me, that was a very important insight. Is there is something very fundamental about the fact that our memory is not a copy perfect of what happened in the past. It's something fundamental about the fact that our contents in memory are forgotten at different rates. There is that, for me, was, and also the fact that we have false memories, that they're systematic and so forth.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm thinking also of like people with highly superior autobiographical memory. Um, they don't have like mental breakdowns, but they do have it interfere with their ability to function in certain ways when they have every single like memory interaction with any person that they've ever encountered coming up as they're talking to them. So I saw one
Right.
interview with a woman with this who just said it's very hard to have a conversation because she's constantly distracted by this kind of running video on the side of every interaction that they've ever had. So um,
One
yeah,
thing that is very interesting with people with with really strong autobiographical memories like that, you're exactly right. There is a lot of distractibility. There is one way in which you can think about it, as using the machinery of contemporary theories of memory, is one thing that your brain needs to be able to do is to separate whether something that you're seeing right now, say this pen,
mhm,
is supposed to be interpreted as a cue to remember a memory, or if it is an item that you have to encode anew. That is,
wow,
they call that pattern completion versus pattern separation. Do I need to use this information that is coming in through my eyes to complete a pattern that is already there? Or do I have to separate this new information from other existing patterns? That's kind of like the idea.
hmm,
And one way of thinking about it is that this conflict is harder to be resolved in individuals with highly superior autobiographical memories relative
interesting.
to. But one thing that is surprising too is that they are prone to the same kinds of memory illusions, MDRS paradigms, sort of
Right.
things. They also generate false memories and so forth. They're equally systematic. So even having really, really good memories, there is still these memory errors that are also prevalent.
Right. No, that's an interesting point. So, suggesting that there's lots of different systems here doing overlapping work. Although I know that you've done some work kind of criticizing the very strict separation of like these different systems, and that and I think so one of the central ideas of your work is that they overlap more than we think, but also with other systems like imagination, which we have traditionally thought to be completely separate. But I want to not get too distracted by that. Actually, I'm already pretty distracted by that. So, um, I mean, so one of the things that the reason I brought up the people with the superior autobiographical memory was in counterpoint to the Voorhees kind of point that you know they their minds don't break down, but it's still not pleasant for them to enjoy. So if they, and even though they don't really meet that ideal because they don't have the perfect recall of everything, as you were just saying, they still have illusions and deficits in other areas. So maybe if you extended it to every memory system that had perfect recall, you really would have a kind of breakdown,
Yeah.
especially in terms of these kind of models of these interior systems that are trying to distinguish between, like you just said, a cue to recall something versus something that needs to be done with as a percept.
Right, exactly. And individuals with highly autobiographical memories vary as far as I understand. And some of them, what happens that they become a little obsessed with the past too. So some of the individuals that I know are collectors of memorabilia and so forth. So they basically live in a world of constant queuing. So there is also this externalization of the queuing that it is helping for them to have better recall. But you're right, they don't break down as much as in the Borges, but partly because they don't have really perfect memories. They just have really highly superior, but not perfect. But nevertheless, in some cases, they do have difficulties in everyday ordinary life.
Right. Yeah. Um, I want to make sure not to forget to bring something up that I'm already kind of forgetting to bring up. Uh, but in this particular place that we're talking about right now, um, how much of a separation do you think there is between the semantic content, the informational content of the memory, and the episodic content, the it's me that's encountering this? So traditionally, like since Tolving, this was postulated to be like a really two separate systems. And I know that gradually over time, we've come to think that this can't be right. But even pre-theoretically, it seems a bit weird to think that there would be this strict separation because in order to have the episodic memory, you've got to categorize all the stuff in it semantically, or so it would seem. So maybe that's too a naive way to think about this. But doesn't it seem, well, it doesn't, well, it seems to me weird that it would have been so firmly entrenched that there's this strict separation between them as opposed to a kind of this intuitive idea that they must overlap in sunset. So was there like empirical results that suggested that they just really strictly were disassociable or something that drove this, or was it just the intuitiveness of the idea?
So that's a great question. So there are two important things there. So first off, the idea that our memory for facts and our memory for like episodes were distinct has been going on since forever. Aquinas distinguishes this and Augustine probably is the earliest that you can think of. There is some people, and I discussed this a little bit in my book, but there's some people that argue that maybe in Aristotle is, maybe, I'm not sure, but very clearly is in Augustine. So Augustine in the 10th book of his Confessions, he just goes, I love this Confessions because it's like, where is God? Let's try to figure out, let's start with our minds. And then he goes chapter by chapter going, it's not here, it's not here, it's not here. But in so doing, he does this beautiful sort of conceptual separation of the faculties of the mind. And when it comes to memory, he talks about the fact that, sometimes in our memory, we store, events that happen in the past, our experiences. But in addition to that, we can store mathematical knowledge, right? Universal laws. He also distinguishes with emotional memory. So and then you can just move forward, and other people have talked about, like even Russell talks about these kinds of distinctions too. So it's something that is not that Tolving came up with the distinction anew. No, it existed in various ways even before that. What is original about Tolving, and this is a point that it doesn't receive as much attention, and I will explain in a second why, because he literally operationalized the distinction. So the distinction between episodic and semantic was an operationalization. It was first introduced by him in 1972 in a volume that had a bunch of papers. He was one of the editors of the volume, and the way in which he presents it is as a contrast category. So he says people talk about immediate as opposed to long-term, visual as opposed to auditory. So what do we, and this whole volume is about semantic memory, because everything that people were doing at the time was, extensions of Ebbinghaus's learning syllables and learning words and so forth. And they talk about that as semantic memory, because it's remembering the meanings of words or the lack of meanings of certain meaningless words and so forth. So he asks in that article, what do you contrast episodic memory against? Semantic memory against. And his idea, which I think is a brilliant idea that sometimes I forget, came from his own research in the 60s on what is called serial ordering effect. So what he was showing is, people know that if you show in a list of words, if you repeat a word 3 times versus if you repeat it 2 times versus if you repeat it only once, you're going to be more likely to remember that a word that was repeated 3 times was in the list relative to 2, relative to 1, right? Now, what Tolving saw is that the problem is that if there's only a matter of repetition of like this, how strong the semantic meaning gets encoded, if you want, you're missing the chance of asking where in the list was the word presented. Was it the first episode or the second episode or the third episode? So that's where it comes from. It comes from for being able to capture the episodicity of the presentation of a word in a serial order list. So he said, and those two things are different because you're not encoding semantic relations or semantic information. What you're encoding is something about the spatiotemporal presentation of the word.
Right.
And if you read that paper in 1972, he is literally giving a computational characterization of what is episodic memory in terms of information that is different from the information that gets encoded in semantic memory. He never talked about consciousness at that point. He never talked about autonoetic consciousness or anything of that nature. That came in 1985. He described those in pure operational terms. So of course, it took off and people talk about different systems. Tolving was always cautious. Not always, actually. He became less cautious later on, but he was back then kind of cautious. In fact, the traditional standard view of memory that we owe to Zola and Squire from their work, in which they clearly distinguish episodic and semantic as 2 different systems, was not very. I don't think that Tolving accepted that double dissociation because he thought that the best evidence that we had was a single dissociation. So even Tolving didn't think of them as entirely 2 dissociable systems. Later on, when consciousness became sort of a wedger between them, that it seemed as, but a lot of people, it seemed pretty obvious that they were dissociable. But the truth is that they aren't. And not only was, there's a little bit of sociology of memory here. Tolving's distinction just took off, but there was a lot of people that were criticizing even his own views in 1983 in his Elements of Episodic Memory. And nowadays, I think everyone would agree that the 2 of them are profoundly intertwined.
Okay. Yeah, good. There's a lot of stuff I want to follow up on there, but so the thing that I keep meaning to bring up, but putting off because we keep bringing up other interesting things up, is this idea that we were mentioning way back before, which was that you didn't see any philosophy of memory for yourself. But meanwhile, I was thinking to myself, but in the early psychology, science of the mind, memory was an important topic, especially for people like Freud. But even maybe later on, with some maybe positive psychologists and stuff like that. So anyway, and then obviously it develops into these things that you're talking about with the full, like, once you get a operationalizable, that's hard to say, something which you can operationalize, a distinction which you can apply this to, then the science really takes off. but it strikes me that at least like the Freudian discussions from Freud and so forth, that that discussion, while recognizably philosophical in many aspects, was largely done in a under the auspices of science, so that people
Mhm.
trained in philosophy weren't really exposed to it, or weren't really discussing that sort of thing. Um, so anyway, I just thought that that was interesting, that there was very, I mean, Freud's theory is very deeply philosophical and not, maybe not very empirical, but it's interesting that even there wasn't much uptake.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. So I take it that what you're meaning that you're referring to is these discussions on repressed memories, right? So um, that's interesting because this notion of repressed memory has gotten the attention of a bunch of people, particularly sort of outside of the scientific realm of memory research, unless they
Yeah.
because the notion of repressed memory, and I wrote recently about this, the notion of repressed memory is a theoretical term that comes with a huge theoretical baggage. Uh, and But the problem is that it comes from a theory that has been utterly debunked.
Can
Now,
I stop you for 1 second
yeah, yeah,
before I want to let you continue? But I noticed you did this in the paper that you wrote on this as well. So I wanted to
yeah.
ask you about this. Do you make a distinction between repression and repressed memory? So do you think repressed memory is a separate category from repression? Like that there is
No,
some psychological mechanism, a defense or not, which aims to keep certain information repressed, as opposed to memories? Or do you think they're synonymous in Freud's theory? Because I would say, couldn't there be like thoughts that are repressed and intentions as well as it's not just memories, right? In the Freudian picture, at least.
yeah, I mean, well, they are in a sense because in the original, in his original theory of in his original seduction theory, which is where the notion of repression comes first, he rejects that theory later on. This we're talking about 1880, 1990, 1893. Then the rejection of that seduction comes. The theory in the sin is in 1897 or something like that. But repression plays a role in his cognitive architecture. According to Freud, you have, this unconscious ideas, and the unconscious ideas have as a property of them, like ideas could be, I don't know, abstract, concrete, or what have you. But one of the properties that all ideas had was traumatic force, right?
Mhm.
So every idea that comes in your mind has a level of traumatic force. Some of them have very low levels of traumatic force. Some of them have high levels of traumatic force. Repression, just remember, this is the whole hydraulic model of the mind. Repression was like a valve that will prevent things in the unconscious to emerge onto the conscious. So that's what the role of repression was, right? If the stuff has and your unconscious has too much traumatic force, repression might not be strong enough, and then it comes out, and you have slip of the tongues, weird habits, weird behaviors, and very strange dreams, and so on and so forth,
Right.
right? Uh, so so the first reference to repress the memories were precisely there, like ideas that were stored in your unconscious. Like we're not talking about memory systems there because that was not an idea then, but they were stored in your unconscious like memories that had a certain level of traumatic force. And if they were repressed by this valve, then they were repressed memories. That's the theory. I mean, I don't think that the theory holds any water whatsoever. There
But
has
just
been,
before we move on, though, but
yeah.
couldn't there also be like a thought, like a spontaneous thought that's not a memory, like your mother walks in and you have some kind of occurring thought that repression is trying to keep mechanism is
Well,
trying to
the
keep out
thing
of
is that,
consciousness. That's not a memory, though,
well,
right?
sure, if you want to call your your desire to distract yourself from thinking about that thought and think about something else, if you want to call that repression, that's up to you. But that's not exactly the same mechanism that Freud is talking about. You're just basically using the same term, but you're referring to something entirely different, and that is fine. I think that part of
But
what
why
has
would it be something different?
because for Freud. that repression is a mechanism. It doesn't have to do with attentional allocation. It's a mechanism of his cognitive architecture, right? It has a particular, it's something, it has a particular ontological status between the conscious and the unconscious, right? So you have to really change your mind about the mind, about how the mind is structured for the term, this is what I argue in my paper, for the term repressed memory to have a referent. It's like it is as if you say like, well, why don't you call oxygen phlogiston if it is the exact same thing? Well, the problem is that for it to be the exact same thing, you would need to change a lot of the laws of physics and the laws of chemistry that we change. So sure, you can call it phlogiston, but it's not really. I
But I
say
was
the
asking
exact
a
same
more
thing.
simple-minded question about Freud's theory, not like, so I was
Right,
just
right, right.
asking within Freud's theory, is there such a thing as repressed thoughts as well as memories? And are you skeptical about that as well? Because you
Well,
said thoroughly debunked, but then when you went on to say what was thoroughly debunked, it was just repressed memories. So I was curious about whether that was like all
oh
there was that was
no, because
repressed on his account, or you thought that was
he
enough to
he
do away with
uses
everything.
he uses interchangeably. Well, thought is not a word that is used that much. Ideas is used more.
Okay.
And anything that it is on the unconscious, that it is forced to remain there by the strength of your repression, and you can modulate your repression and stuff. All of that is going to be repressed X, where X could be a feeling, a memory, a thought,
I
an
see.
idea.
Okay. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
but then when you say repressed memory, you're just using that as like a placeholder for anything that's repressed, and you think that's the thing that's been debunked is just the idea that there's
Yeah, I
repression.
think that there are people that use the notion of repressed memory as equivalent to something that I rather not think about,
Right.
right?
Hmm.
But that's not what Freud meant.
So by
And
comparison, you talk about dissociative amnesia, or I'm sorry, not
yeah,
this.
yeah,
Go ahead. You tell us
the
what it is you're
dissociative
talking about.
amnesia, which is some people say like, oh, well, but there are instances of dissociative amnesia. And part of what I claim in that paper is that they're not equivalent. That, they overlap a little bit what repressed memory is, but they are not that clear. They are extraordinarily rare, to be honest. This is so one of the things that happens with these instances of dissociative amnesia is that you forget a, a period of your time, right? But by a period, I mean, like what happened between January and March of 1997. Say, like, I don't have any memories like that. That's very different from having one memory of one episode that is repressed and I cannot get to that. So the phenomena are not identical, right? So again, I talk a little bit in more of this kind of like a philosophy of sciencey paper, but the semantic field of both terms are not identical. They don't refer to exactly the same phenomena. So it's not that people have been using repressed memory in the guise of a different term like dissociative amnesia. No, they are not exactly identical phenomena.
Hmm.
So the stuff that Freud originally thought that the term would refer to just doesn't have a referent. It is not only false; it has no sense in the
So
Freudian
that's, I
sense.
like this argument that you have, because you're like, so one thing we could say is, does it pick out something regardless of what the meaning in the theory was? And you say no. And then the other
Yeah.
is, okay, so but does it have any role to play in a theory that we take seriously in our current psychology? And no. So therefore it's neither.
Yeah.
Unless someone wants
Yeah.
to revive it and give it a new sense or something. I guess
But the
that's
question
open,
is
but the
why would
question
they do
why?
it? I think
Yeah.
that's right. The question is why would they do it? It's like, oh, I am pro-phlogiston. But like
And bring back phlogiston.
bring black phlogiston, like why? So that's the thing. The thing is the term is very attractive. Freud, as you know, had captured the attention of a bunch of people. It's very interesting because I'm Colombian, and in Colombia I had to study a lot of Freud. Like
Oh, okay.
and there were two possibilities. If you were purely Freudian, you can also become Lacanian if you wanted. But I studied as an undergraduate. I studied at least a year of Freud. I read all the interpretation of dreams. I read I've read a ton of Freud in my life because Freud was very and continued to be very, very, very important. Uh, but not so much in the United States.
Yeah.
I read, among other things, Grunbaum's awesome Foundation of Psychoanalysis book. And when I moved to the US, Freud was not as important as it was for me, an undergrad 24 years ago or whatever. So I think that there is an interesting division here that people in academia in the United States, especially in psychology in the United States, don't think of as Freud as important a figure as people in other countries do.
Interesting.
But you do see Freud quite overrepresented in non-psychological disciplines. So for instance, Freud has a lot of importance in literature and in English departments and so forth. So there is quite an attractive component to the theory of Freud, and there are some things that seem sort of undeniable. I mean, this is what happens with theories, like Popper would say that are unfalsifiable. Many of them, the allure of the terms and the apparent coverage of their explanations and their predictions is just so alluring that people just love them, and they hate when they are shown to that they are wrong, right? So I think that a little bit of that is what happens with terms like repressed memory, and people want them to be true, right?
So when I've spoken to people about this, and to be honest, I haven't spoken to many, but I know a couple pro-Freudians, and one thing that I've heard them say is that, look, fine, great, his theory of the mind has been debunked, wonderful, but we're not interested in that. We're like interested in helping people understand themselves and come to deeper realizations about blah blah blah. And Freud's theory helps people do that. So in a therapeutic setting, talking about repressed memories and traumatic events that you're keeping from yourself, that helps people come to grips with things that they, whatever, psychologically need to. And so one argument that, and I'm curious about your reaction to this.
Yeah.
One argument is that, yeah, the science of it, great. It's not science. It's a way, it's an interpretive, well, I don't want to say story, but it's an interpretive framework that you can get people to make progress towards well-being within. And therefore it's good, and should be kept.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is that yes and no. So the thing that I would say to that is, I think it's true that for a lot of people, psychotherapy works. I did psychotherapy for 4 years, and it worked. It was great when I was in college, partly because I was very interested in Freud, and I was very interested in mental health too, and so forth. And I must say, it worked beautifully on me. But that being said, I think it worked beautifully on me, not because of the reasons the theory says that it is working, but because I was talking to a person with whom I have what Freudians will call transference, namely, meaning I really got along with, which was my therapist, 3 times a week. The power of talking to someone that cares is extraordinary for a lot of people. For some people, the Bring-Myers, categories might work for them. For a lot of people, the horoscope works. Talking to someone that cares works for an enormous amount of people. And if you are doing that 3 times a week, for 45 minutes, which is what you need to do at a minimum for psychotherapy, well, of course that it is going to work. Notice that there are other therapies that are not Freudian based and that are not necessarily cognitive behavioral therapies either, and that are also based on talking, that are quite successful. So there is this literary therapies. The last name Ellis was the psychiatrist, I forgot his first name, who was one of the pioneers of this, in which, for instance, you have particular kinds of difficulties. Say, I don't know, as I was bullied in high school, like severely bullied. So you read, your therapist puts you to read The Hobbit, or where smaller
Where there's an
individuals
adventurous and courage building experience.
Exactly. And then you go 3 times a week and discuss the books, and then they see how those books relate to you and so forth. And for a lot of people, are extraordinarily helpful. Do they work because of the Freudian transference and the unconscious and the traumatic force? Like, no, there is something extraordinarily therapeutic about talking. There is something extraordinarily therapeutic about being liked and people presenting a different perspective and so forth. I mean, Wittgenstein had criticisms of that nature that I am entirely sympathetic with. Wittgenstein criticized Freud by saying he has this beautiful metaphor in the Remarks and the Foundations of Philosophy of Psychology, where he says that the psychotherapy is like those drawing exercises in which they show you just an arm and they say complete the rest of the figure. They say like there are lots of ways in which the rest of the figure could go, and I think that that's a lot of what happens with therapy, and they could go in ways that are consistent with Freud's view, but they could go in all sorts of ways that are also going to help people.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, well, I know you have to go in within the next.
No, that's all right.
So I don't want to. I could be dwelling on this forever because you're interesting. Your work is interesting, and your thoughts about it are even more interesting. But I want to, if you could connect this, or if we could connect this up to the memory wars, and I
Yeah.
wonder what your sort of considered position, if you have one, on this. So the memory wars refers to this extraordinary debate between memory researchers but also the larger public, I would say, about repressed memories of childhood abuse and all sorts of. I mean, there was the Satanic Panic in the 80s. A lot of this revolved around people recalling, ritualistic abuse apparently, and later people argued it was under the, guidance of certain sorts of therapeutic methods, involving a lot of counterfactual thinking and
Mhm.
recalling of things in the past and going over them that we
Yeah,
sort
yeah.
of now think influence the way that these things go. So there's a long history of that, and you're more of an expert on this than I am. But I sort of wonder if you could tell us a little bit more than I just said about it, and also where you sort of think things stand currently with respect to this question.
Well, so I guess there are lots of things to say about that because depending on when you're coming from, uh, you might have um, sympathies for one side more than the other. Um, so I have a lot of sympathy for sides in which people remember events that happened in the past and for which they didn't think too much, and something trigger a particular memory of that. And it turns out that they're true events, and some of them are like horrible events too. But I also like to think from the other side. So I'll give you an example. I don't know if you have read a book called Picking Cotton.
Wow.
Are you familiar with that? So that book was so it's like a bestseller a while back, and it's a real life story of a woman whose name I'm forgetting, who was an undergraduate at Wake Forest in the 80s, and at some point an individual walked to her apartment and raped her repeatedly that
Oh.
night and stayed with her for a little while and so forth, and then left and escaped and his last name is Cotton.
Hmm.
And later on, there was an individual that was captured. Well, actually, the individual that raped her, I just destroyed the story. That the individual that raped her was not named Cotton,
Yeah,
but
I do.
an,
I
an
now know. I
individual.
know the story, but I didn't know the name of the
Yeah.
book. Okay.
But the individual named Cotton was captured at some point, and he was put, on a line and so forth. And she identified him immediately. Basically, said like that's the person that raped me and so forth. And when this happens like within less than a day, or I forgot, it was almost immediate. And this was a very close encounter. It was not very quick. It took some time. Like they were like together, and she was 100% completely sure that this was the individual. And he was in prison for like 11 years or so until finally other evidence exonerated him. And nowadays, both the victim and Mr. Cotton toured the United States talking about, the problems and the ease with which you can misidentify someone like in this particular situation, right? And this is 11 years of a person in prison for
Yeah.
being falsely, like wrongly identified by a person whose memory was, such that she thought completely for sure that this was the individual, right? So you have those two sides. Of course, that it could happen that because of awfulness that happened when you were a child and so forth, you did everything within your power not to encode any information, everything within your power to distract yourself from never having those thoughts. And as it happens, when you have information that you don't rehearse, you forget it,
Right.
right? Maybe you have never thought of the quadratic formula for the past,
How dare
you
you bring
know,
up the quadratic formula?
for maybe you haven't thought about it for the past 20 years, but then all of a sudden your son comes from school and said, Dad, I have this homework, and then you see the quadratic formula, you say like, oh, I remember this. So I cannot deny that those are experiences that are very common as well.
Mhm.
Now, my point with this is, one has to be very careful. Both things can happen, and both things do happen. My point is simply that the science of memory has the resources to explain many of these cases without having to appeal to magical mechanisms of repressions or superegos jumping on our ids and so forth.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So both things do happen. That's something that we had to be very careful to make sure you do spontaneously recall things that you didn't realize happened until, I mean, yeah, you didn't realize that had happened, but did actually
Yeah.
happen. And you also can falsely remember, like really seemingly like from the inside, it feels like 100%. You could just have that phenomenology and be wrong.
Yeah, but I
Um,
mean, it could happen. One way of that I like to think it is to normalize those events. Hasn't it happened to you at some point that someone reminds you, a family member, let's say, reminds you of something that happened when you were a child that you literally haven't thought of for 20 years?
yeah.
That happens, right? And so what we're talking is about that kind of phenomenon as well. It could occur that it just happens that it's a kind of different experience instead of like, oh yeah, I remember that baseball card. Now you're remembering something that it is. And the immediate intuition is, uh, but how is it possible that this is the sort of thing that you would remember, right?
Yeah.
If
No, I know
I
exactly. Just not
that
to get,
that's the intuition. But it turns out that no, it might be possible that precisely what you tried was not to think about it, and the power of not thinking about something. I
Mhm.
mean, we know this from Heb, right? So I tell this to people that say like, oh, why is it that every time that I cross this corner where I used to have ice cream with my ex-boyfriend, I always end up thinking about him. It's like, well, because you keep doing it.
Yeah,
So change the
exactly.
corner, go to other places,
They
break
won't
that
wire
association
together.
between us. They wire together. So that let them not wire together.
Right.
And you can do that with lots of different kinds of memories.
Yeah. Is this related in any way to what's called motivated forgetting?
A, a, a little bit, but the problem with motivated forgetting, but yes, so it does have to do with that. The problem with and some people say like, well, repressed memory and motivated forgetting are probably kind of like the same thing. The problem with the motivated forgetting is that our best evidence is that it's not super good at erasing the whole event,
Mhm.
right? A lot of the tests that we have for motivated forgetting are basically lists of words, and what you do is that people that are in the condition of motivated forgetting versus not, like, tend to recall fewer, but it's not that
Right.
they don't recall any. So but there is another kind of motivation. This gets a little bit in, like, I guess, philosophy of action. You
Mhm.
can be motivated to not remember something right now, or you can be motivated to not be reminded of something, in your life. Like, right? So it's like when people say, I think that they distinguish between synchronic and diachronic
Right.
strategies for motivation, right? So there is a motivated forgetting, which is, so again, going back to my example of the person who said like, I always remember my boyfriend, my former boyfriend, whenever, because we used to have ice cream here, and when I drive to the ice cream, like, I always remember him. So like, well, stop doing that. Like, change your route. there are lots of ways in which you can avoid, the paths that will make you remember something. If you hate that house, then you move away from the house, and then you have fewer ways of. So that's a way of motivating forgetting, that it is more diachronic rather than
Right.
synchronic. So my guess is that a combination of those two things can really lead to a very powerful forgetting.
Interesting. So once again, there's a million things that I want to follow up on, but just selecting from those million things, and bringing this sort of because the question I was asking about the memory wars, and one of the things that came out of our discoveries or our investigation of this was the ideas of consolidation and the ideas of reconsolidation. And this has led to, I would say, psychologists sort of rethinking the idea that of memories of being any sort of like stably stored
Yeah.
in long-term memory or anything like that, and led to a more of a widespread recognition that well, the more you rehearse a memory, the more malleable it is in a sense. And so, and some of the techniques that we know that induce these kind of what are called implanted or false memories involve, thinking about, past situations with would have gone a certain way or something like that. And you can get people to kind of accept generally that, this is the famous mall experiment from
Yeah.
Loftus a long time ago. So I was wondering what your thoughts about this phenomenon are, about memory implantation in generally, and whether this is not just what happens all the time, as opposed to some specific, like this is what memory is, right? Memory is just this malleable system that's never really quite accurate. Or do you think of it in a different way?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. There's a lots of things to say there. So the first one is the issue about consolidation and reconsolidation. So for the people listening to this the discussion, so the term consolidation is an old term that suggested that when memories actually precedes the semantic episodic distinction. But the thought was that that when a memory has been encoded, it became sort of fixed, and it is unchangeable, right? And kind of like stored, is, if you want, is another way of thinking. It gets consolidated, and the thought is that once the memory is consolidated, then you will be able to retrieve it. Later on, the idea of memories being consolidated was linked to the need for the hippocampus to produce the consolidation. Namely, the thought was the hippocampus is required for encoding of a memory, and it is required until it's consolidated. But once the memory is consolidated, then the hippocampus is no longer required. And the reason why it was thought that happened is because individuals with hippocampal damage, like HM, for instance, allegedly they have anterior grade amnesia, namely they could not encode new memories after the accident, but they could still recover memories that happened prior to the accident. That, I think, has been sort of, if not fully debunked, has been really, really hard questioned. There is some work by Lee Nadell and colleagues and Maurice Moscovich and others showing that that actually the extent to which your hippocampus and surrounding areas, that tissue remains, correlates linearly with your what is called Ribot's law, which is the regression of how much your memories have. And I have written a little bit about this too, but even when you look at what HM remembered, you wouldn't say that he had an intact autobiographical memory of his past. He actually remembered very few events. And here's the second point of what you were saying. It is not clear that the events were fully episodic. They seem to be highly semanticized. So one of the things that you were saying is that when you repeat a memory over and over and over, then it becomes more and more malleable. Yes and no. There is one kind of repetition that tends to sort of devoid the memory from its modal components or its sensory components and make it more and more abstract, if you want. People call that semanticization. So, it might be possible that the first time that you learn that Caracas was the capital of Venezuela. You sort of rehearsed the words of your teacher saying Caracas is the capital of Venezuela, and maybe you rehearsed a little bit, the map of Venezuela, seeing where Caracas was. But soon enough, you're studying for that test and so forth, just seeing the words and seeing the words, you completely forgot about the teacher, you completely forgot about the classroom, but Caracas is the capital of Venezuela remains, right?
Mm.
So that process is a process of semanticization that takes place, and repetition helps for that. It is thought to be computationally efficient, right? Because you just
Right.
sort of stripping off the essential components from all these computationally very expensive details. Um, Now, the other kind of rehearsal that you're right, that it is highly malleable is when you rehearse the autobiographical episodic memory in a context that pollutes, as it were, the original memory trace with external information. The example that you have of the shopping mall is a good one. Is they call that imagination inflation, which is the idea that when you recall a memory in the context, in an imaginative context, that also involves, I mean, if you think about it, if you recall a memory, and recalling a memory involves the reactivation of lots of the same sensory areas that were active during coding. And in addition to that, you're using those very same areas to evoke new sensory contents. I mean, the probability that the pattern of activation gets contaminated upon reconsolidation is pretty high.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of that, is I think that's kind of like what underlies imagination inflation, and that's why it is very easy for you to, especially with details that are not as central, details that are less associated with other stored details, those details that are less central, that tend to be much more likely to be overwritten by the information that you are imagining at the time of retrieving.
Interesting. You used a couple words there that made me think. You said polluted and contaminated,
Yeah.
but it's not always bad because
Mhm.
you need to update memories with new information. If you find out something new, like you're talking to someone and you're telling them, "Remember that time we went blah blah," and you were wearing that scarf, so you want to encode that or update yours. So sometimes it's useful. But in
Yes,
this case, I
absolutely.
understand the mall case. It wasn't
Yeah.
useful. They were trying to convince this kid that he was left alone and at the mall,
Oh,
or something
absolutely.
like that.
I
Yeah.
mean, 100%. A lot of my research, experimental research, is
Mm-hmm.
literally to say
Exactly.
the reason the reason why we update our memories with information that is extraneous is probably actually quite adaptive.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, for instance, counterfactual thinking, when used in certain ways, has this benefit, right? Here's what happens. So something bad happens to you, so certain outcome doesn't occur to you that you wanted, right? So your typical reaction is to have regret, and but another reaction that you sometimes have is like, well, at least this didn't happen. Instead, that could have been much worse, right? So
Right.
suppose that you get into a car accident, and as a result of that, your car was totaled, and it's like, oh, this sucks. But it could have been much worse. Like you could have lost your legs, or maybe like your capacity to walk. I guess if you lose your legs, you probably lose your capacity to walk too. But
Yeah.
like something much worse. And oftentimes, this is the kinds of imaginations that we get in. Of course, that we imagine could have been regretful. But when you compare yourself to these imaginative worlds in which you are actually worse off, then you compare and you start saying like, well, maybe this wasn't as bad, could have been worse. And what is happening? Well, that you're entertaining certain uh, emotions that are changing the tone of the original memory, such that the next time that you remember the accident is not going to hurt as much. So that's part of what we do in using counterfactual thinking in the context of autobiographical memory reactivation to try to mollify those memories. Um, Oftentimes they're bad, right? I mean, it's not that we do it all the time for good. A lot of our regrets and our repetitive ruminations precisely use this mechanism for non-adaptive purposes, because
Mm-hmm.
people end up thinking like, they end up having even more negative thoughts about it. But I think that they can be employed for good. So you're
Yeah.
right. Contaminating memories is not always a bad thing. Often is a good thing.
So what in the case of like controlling the emotional volume, so to speak, of the
Yeah.
memory. I know you coined a term for that. I forgot what the term was.
Memory mollification,
Yeah,
like
mollification. Right. You're
yeah,
mollifying the memory, not not
and
modifying
mollifying
it.
them.
Uh,
Yeah.
so is this is related to like what's sometimes called memory dampening, maybe?
Yes.
But that's
And
drug induced, obviously. But this is like a natural version of that. Is that the idea?
yeah, yeah. And then they often, I mean, it is very likely that if the dampening, for instance, is with certain chemicals that have an acid component, like propanolol, for instance,
Yeah.
and things like that, is very likely that the mechanisms are similar to that. I
Hmm.
mean, there is a little bit of discussion as to exactly what the mechanisms in the brain are, because for one, some people think, well, there might be an extinction kind of memories, mechanisms, or another possibility is that they are propanolol induced, or rather, like, this kind of amnestic induced.
Right.
I think it might be possible that there's a combination of the two. I don't have a view specifically on what they are, but yes, it's related. I think that are all in the family of
Interesting.
that.
And because
Uh,
you could think of it going the other way too, not so maybe you had a family vacation and there was like a big fight between the uncle and the cousin or something, but also you had a fun time at the ride at the amusement park. So you could choose to focus on that and try to amplify, in a sense, the good
yeah,
feelings associated. Then you would remember the whole trip with this kind of pleasant,
yeah,
even though you remember the fight, you wouldn't remember it maybe as unpleasant or something like that. So there's this constant reinterpretation
for
of
sure.
the not just the
And
content but the emotional aspect of the memories as well, which is
absolutely, I
what your
think
work is
that
highlighting.
oftentimes we do that. I mean, that happens a lot, and oftentimes we do that in collective recollection. I mean,
Mm,
when you get along with friends from high school or when friends with college, and you remember the same episodes and the same events that you were in together, oftentimes what you're doing is heightening those positive emotions together, right?
interesting.
There is a huge component of uh, you know this mollification that happens in joint reminiscing, but also this amplification that happens in joint reminiscing.
Mm. This is such an interesting discussion. I know you have to go, so I know I want to give you some time to be able
Yeah,
to
yeah.
go. I would ask just one question to sort of end this. Maybe this is not a quick question, but Freud. We've been talking about Freud a lot, and you said his theories thoroughly debunked. Repressed memories don't have a referent or a sense. So at this point, I think it would be safe to say that your view is that Freud's theory doesn't count as like a scientific theory that we should have any confidence in. But I also heard you say that was unfalsifiable, maybe. So do you think Freud counts as that currently we should think of it as pseudoscience, or just as not a scientific theory, or as something else?
Interesting. So if you take Freud's, and here it's interesting because he had like at least three different views, but suppose that what you refer by Freud's view is something like the seduction theory.
Yeah.
If you take the seduction theory to be a scientific theory that should be put, on a par with, I don't know, theories of reinforcement learning or something like that, I would call it, and as a result, that it should be treated in the market of ideas at the same level, then I would call it as a pseudoscience.
Hmm.
For me, I mean, the term pseudoscience is complex, and I was recently involved in lots of discussions about pseudoscience.
Yeah, I thought we were going
But
to talk about that, but we'll have to have a
yeah,
second
well, we
discussion
have
about this
12
if you
minutes,
want to.
so but
Okay.
this is part of the information integration theory ladder,
Yeah.
and pseudoscience is a tricky word because it's a word that is primarily a social sanction, right? It seems to me
Right.
more
Yes.
so than that clear demarcations of what is science and what it is not science. I think it is a social sanction. And I understood this actually after reading On the Fringe, which is a wonderful book that I recommend to absolutely everyone who is interested in issues having to do with what counts as pseudoscience and not pseudoscience. The bottom line is there are lots of ways of being pseudoscience. There is no clear scientific demarcation of this is science, this is not science, but serves a purpose to call something pseudoscience. And the reason why I think it, and in my view, for something to be pseudoscience is for it to claim that it is the sort of thing that deserves NSF funding, NIH funding, that they has a place in hospitals to make predictions about whether someone is alive or is not alive, or conscious or not conscious, and so forth. If it is an endeavor that it is trying to compete for the same kind of resources that scientific theories are competing, and it is not a science, it is a pseudoscience. However, if it is an endeavor that it is not trying to compete with that, it is, right, like the horoscope, like astrology, right?
Yeah.
They are not claiming to be pseudoscience. Like, I read the horoscope from time to time. Yesterday I was having a discussion with my wife as to whether, such and such were compatibles and so forth. But I don't think that I am engaging in the kind of rigorous sort of enterprise that I engage when I'm in. So so the question is for the Freudian. Is the Freudian thinking that they should have access to NSF money to identify where the organ of repression is in the brain, all those things? If they say yes, then I said, well, this is pseudoscience, and I don't think that they should deserve grant money to do this research. But by contrast, if they are saying, well, we're not interested in cognitive architecture, we're not trying to say anything literal about the structure of the mind, we're trying to say something metaphorical about the structure of the mind, no different than Plato's distinctions in the soul, right? And comparing it with the city and the republic and so forth. If that's what they are doing, then I will call it a non-science and go ahead and continue doing that. That's where I do think that the term pseudoscience is a social sanction, and but it's a useful term. It is a term that helps to curb certain projects so that they don't waste taxpayers' money.
Yeah, I was asked to sign the letter, and I didn't sign it, mostly because I wanted to add something about what pseudoscience was, and they said it's already written, and I was like, well, then, I can't.
Yeah.
But because I agree with you that the word pseudoscience should be used in certain contexts, but I also think that because it is a social sanction, you can't just throw it around without saying like why you think the thing is. And I really felt like the letter was sort of bringing up too many things, like the panpsychism stuff. That's not relevant. Like, so some of it, like I was like, okay, well, why? We've got to say more about what the pseudoscientific aspect is. So I agree with you that I think that what the important and what to my mind was a main complaint, which wasn't highlighted enough, and I think maybe there's a follow-up that will highlight enough, was that the people are presenting this as though there's lots of evidence for it, when it's not clear that could be evidence for it, or even so that's really the main question in my mind, is like, how are people saying this is a main empirical theory when like it's not clear that there could be any empirical evidence? I mean, some people are going around saying that the neurons don't even exist because they don't have causal power. So it's like, okay. Then how is that a neuroscientific theory, an empirical theory at all? Now, I'm not saying you can't answer that. I'm just saying that I think you're right, that the thing you want to focus on, what makes something pseudoscientific, is whether they're asking for scientific funds, money from.
Right. So there is that issue. It's funny because when Hakon and the others asked me to sign the letter, I thought that the word pseudoscience was one of the least controversial aspects of the letter.
Oh, really?
Part of what happens too is that I have been used, in science, there are letters that are expressions of concern. And that it seemed pretty obvious to me that that's what it was. Expressions of concern are typically fewer than 500 words. And what happens is that it is, experts in the field, when a paper is published in Science saying like, we discovered the gene for, I don't know, long nails or whatever. And and some long nail experts think that there is something completely wrong about this, but they weren't part of the reviewers or anything of that nature. They want to say like, look, this is presented as the position of the field, but we are in that field and we're prominent in that field, and we just have an expression of concern. and we only have 500 words, right? So that is what I thought that the letter was going to be. So of course that you cannot get into debates. I think I wrote a little bit about this in my
Yeah,
Substack, but
exactly.
I don't
You
think
did.
that you can get into debates of. I thought that the issue with panpsychism was also like not great. It's like, oh, look, this theory is false because it has these weird metaphysical consequences. Like, nah, that's just not a very good argument.
Yeah.
But pseudoscience, the word was definitely not controversial. So for me, for reasons that I explained there, it seemed to me that it was pseudoscience for these reasons, trying to vie for
But I
research.
will have to just say though that while I really enjoyed your Substack article, and I'll make sure there's a link to it so other people can read it because it really lays it all very nicely out your position. None of those arguments were in the original letter. So like your personal
Right.
history, going and talking with Julio and being at the conference and having dinner with them and really getting to the bottom of like some of his views, that led you to this considered opinion, in my sort of view, rightly. That wasn't clear in the letter, so anyone reading it wouldn't know that. They'd be like, "Whoa, what? Why is this word pseudoscience there?" Because to me, that is a bit of a flag. If you're going to throw a word out like that, then it's like, okay, we want to make sure that the reasons for it are clearly laid out, rightly or wrongly, so everyone sort of knows what's going
Yeah.
on.
The problem is
Um,
that a 500
you
letter,
can't do it
you
exactly.
cannot do it. And again, what I thought was, you know, I never thought that it was going to explode like that, partly because I am
Well, let me
loving
just
the
say, you know what, real
periphery.
fast though,
Yeah,
because we wrote an
yeah,
earlier letter that was a letter of concern to the NEH or someone, NIH, someone, yeah, and somebody saying, you know, hey, IIT, there's some worry about it being empirical, and
yeah.
you're listing it as one of the main like research focuses here. And that letter didn't blow up and cause controversy. And I think part of the reason was that we didn't use that term, which is kind of, you know, it gets people riled up. So
Yeah, I mean that's true, but like when I signed it, and I didn't hesitate a whole lot, to be honest, because I just thought, well, if anyone asks me, I will say what I said in my Substack, for instance.
yeah,
I do have my reasons. These are 500 letters, and if I am gonna go down in history as one of the signatories of a theory of saying like this theory is pseudoscientific, I don't mind. Like that, I
okay.
prefer to be on that side of the history than in the other. So I feel like that is the honest thing for me to do. And people might say, "Oh, but that was very cruel" and so forth. But there were people like that. Likeness
Well,
was
I'm not saying that it was cruel or anything
yeah.
like that. So that's not what I'm saying. No, no,
But at any rate, I think I think that that letter was very useful because we have an expression in Spanish that says that if the river rumbles, it's because it's carrying rocks, which is like if
no.
there is a lot of noise, it's because there is something really going
Yeah,
on.
that's a good expression.
And I feel that this just uncover that there is something really deeply concerning in the science of consciousness that it could, for well, all I know, be just prevalent a lot of cognitive neuroscience, which is we have a bunch of theories out there. Lots of those theories have
Yeah,
relatively, similar to my concerns that I have when consciousness, when I switched more to memory. And I got, well,
yeah.
maybe a lot of people started pointing fingers at the IIT, but they noticed that there were three fingers pointing at them.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good point. I mean, I wanted to ask you about it. I mean, I'm curious why or if you are, I mean, it's a total non sequitur, but something I wanted to bring up before, but whether you are an eliminativist about memory, given what the science of memory has uncovered, an eliminativist about the folk psychological category, um, or whether you
Well,
think
that
that
gets
that's
us.
still like something that's useful to keep around, or
I
you
think
know,
it's very useful. I'm a kind of like a pragmatist in my need to keep those terms around. I'm definitely not an eliminativist. I am what I was guess what you would call a non-reductive materialist. I mean, I'm
yeah.
Dennett's student after all, so I am very sympathetic to this kind of like stances sort of thing.
Yeah.
And a lot of the stances are practical, and a lot of the stances are just sort of I have leanings toward behaviorism. I do think that I don't think that the brain is easily distinguishable in terms of systems, the way in which we used to think, right?
Right.
I I think the brain is clunky and is a mess. It's very entangled, like Luis Bezoa said in his latest book. And finding one-to-one correlates between folk psychological terms and neural terms is, I think, basically impossible. It might happen, but it will be most like the exception rather than the rule.
Mhm.
And faculty, like what are the faculties is an exercise a lot more in pragmatism than it is in like, one-to-one ontology, it seems to me.
Interesting. Well, I really got it. You have literally 30 seconds to get to your next
Yeah.
meeting, so I got to let you go. But Felipe, thank you so much for joining me. It's been a tremendously fun discussion. I hope you'll come back. I feel like we barely scratched the surface on so many interesting things. So I'd love to have
Yeah,
another conversation with you, as a matter of fact.
I'll be happy to. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you for accepting. And just hang on for a second. I'll say bye off air, but